Looting was part and parcel of medieval warfare. You came, you stole, you left. But even with the introduction of new weapons and technology, it appears that the practice of looting is just as much a part of 21st century warfare.
The president is actively looking at how he can deal with the fact that as we seize these assets, our goal is not to give them back. Our goal is to put them to a better use than that. But I'll be careful in what I say today because there's an ongoing kind of policy process around how we end up dealing with that question. But rest assured that the goal is not just to sit on them for a while and then pass them all back.
The White House hasn't officially stated the total worth of Russian assets seized by the U.S. and its allies, but in addition to more than $300 billion in foreign exchange reserves, they also include yachts and real estate in other countries. But now Washington is saying that it has no plans to return the private assets of private individuals back to their owners, even when the conflict ends. In any other circumstance, that would be considered theft, and the person who did it would be charged accordingly. But it seems as though when you're America, you can do whatever you want, and then do it over and over again. After all, it was Washington last year that froze $7 billion worth of Afghanistan's assets after the Taliban came sweeping to power. That, coupled with crushing sanctions, led to a humanitarian crisis that has put millions of people at risk. In response, China called out the hypocrisy from the U.S.
Without the consent of the Afghan people, the U.S. willfully disposes of assets that belong to the Afghan people, even keeping them as its own. This is no different from the conduct of bandits. This latest example has once again laid bare that the rules-based order the U.S. claims to champion is not the kind of rules and order to defend the weak and uphold justice, but to maintain its own hegemony.
And that's not all. Following the 2003 invasion of Iraq, photos surfaced showing U.S. soldiers posing with gold bars, which the U.S. military quickly claimed was part of a $500 million stash found on a truck during a routine traffic stop. However, it was a different case for the 4 U.S. soldiers who were arrested after they were accused of trying to steal $1 million worth of assets from Saddam Hussein's palace in Baghdad just 1 month later. As for what happened to all of that gold, well, we may never know. But the U.S. didn't stop there. Back in 2011, Iraq submitted a letter to the United Nations calling on the U.S. to return $17 billion in profits from the sale of Iraqi oil, which Washington had originally promised would be given back to the country for reconstruction efforts.
All indications are that the institutions of the United States of America committed financial corruption by stealing the money of the Iraqi people, which was allocated to develop Iraq, and that it was about $17 billion.
The Department of Defense itself admitted in a 2011 audit report that it had lost more than $6.6 billion worth of Iraq's oil and gas money, with a special inspector general for Iraq reconstruction calling it the largest theft of funds in national history. Plus, it was only after 18 years that the U.S. finally agreed last year to return more than 17,000 stolen artifacts to Iraq after they were looted from the country's museums by the U.S. military. Another oil-rich country that has received similar treatment is Syria. But in that case, former President Trump never hid his motives when it came to plans for Syria's natural resources.
We're keeping the oil. Remember that. I've always said that. Keep the oil. We want to keep the oil. $45 million a month. Keep the oil. We've secured the oil.
The U.S. military still has troops stationed in Syria's northeast region, as reports suggest the oil continues to be smuggled from the country with the help of those U.S. forces. And on that, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad says there is one major reason.
It's about money and it's about oil. Of course, we are angry. Every Syrian is angry. This is looting.
It was the same in Libya, with the U.S. and the U.K. freezing nearly $50 billion worth of the country's assets in 2011 and then refusing to give the money to the Libyan people following the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. And in Venezuela, where the U.S. froze more than $340 million worth of the country's assets in 2019, and then announced that it would release $150 million to opposition leader Juan Guaido in 2021, who Washington recognizes as the country's president, even though he's unelected.
In their criminal adventures to plunder Venezuela's gold, oil and other lucrative resources, both Britain and the US are exposing themselves before the entire world as having no interest at all in supporting human rights, freedom and democracy in Venezuela. On the contrary, both Britain and the US continue to demonstrate their utter contempt towards the Venezuelan people and their right to determine their own future.
So much for a rules-based order and so much for the American Constitution, as the U.S. has shown time and time again that when it pledges to defend freedom and democracy in a country, what it actually means is that it plans to seize and control the assets of the people, leaving them with a humanitarian crisis.
What you're seeing is kind of like the equivalent of a major and abusive policy that's been happening in the United States for decades now called basically what happens when if somebody's accused of a crime, their assets, they're not convicted. If they're accused of a crime, their assets can be taken. And that's kind of what you're seeing over here, but I'm not even sure there's an actual accusation happening, but rather people's property is being stolen. So it's not new, but it is absolutely morally disgusting. It is absolutely reprehensible. It goes against the spirit of American law. It just goes against the spirit of law generally. I mean, the most basic part of law is that if somebody's accused of a crime, they're accused, then they have a trial, then they're found guilty or not guilty. And if they're found guilty, yes, they might lose some property. That's part of law. But doing that without a trial isn't law. That's barbarism.